Okay guys, so this video is going to talk about moving from research to writing. At this point, you've completed your research, or at least the initial parts of it, but now you need to move into writing the paper where you're actually going to use that research. So what does moving from research to writing involve? Well, in part, it involves coming up with a central argument or a thesis, which your research should reveal to you. Remember how we discussed in class that you shouldn't discuss research just to find supporting evidence for an opinion or point of view that you already have. You should go into your research open to discovering whatever it is you might discover. After you have the thesis figured out, you'll need to go through the research and cluster related information. Remember the clustering from our pre-writing strategies video from last week? And then you're going to need to figure out which of those clusters are going to provide the strongest evidence to support your thesis. Okay, so we're going to break those steps down a little bit here. The first one is to let your research reveal the thesis to you. You need to start by reviewing the rhetorical elements of your assignment. What's the genre? What's the purpose? Who's your audience? What's the rhetorical situation? How are all of these elements going to influence the kind of document that you need to compose? Then you need to read over your research carefully and look for patterns of information. For example, maybe some sources agree with one point of view while others disagreed, or maybe some sources or one side of the argument provided more convincing evidence to support their perspectives while the other sources offered opinions but didn't offer a lot of supporting evidence. So we're going to try this out with MWA number 1, which is the review of your campus resource. So first, we're going to review the rhetorical elements of the assignment. So we've got the genre is a review. The purpose of the assignment and of this genre is to review and evaluate a campus resource in terms of how it alleviates or does not alleviate student stress. The audience for this assignment is President Frank, and the rhetorical situation is that President Frank is asking students to send letters about which campus resources help or do not help alleviate student stress. And he's doing this because he's having some trouble deciding who gets money and who doesn't. So then we need to ask ourselves, how is research going to fit into this kind of document? So for starters, we know that because we're writing a review, we have to address certain elements of that genre, like establishing common expectations. So we're going to need to come up with our common expectations for a student resource, meaning we need to decide what characteristics we will be evaluating the resource on, and then use research to support our evaluations within those different common expectation categories. When we think about our audience, we know that President Frank takes his job seriously, and he has a big responsibility in distributing money to student resources on campus. This means that he's probably looking for solid, convincing evidence to support any argument he reads, because he has to make big decisions based on that argument and its evidence. Finally, we know that we'll be writing a letter, which means that we need to be able to quote, summarize, and paraphrase our research efficiently so that we don't go on and on and on, since most letters are fairly short and we have a lot of information to convey. The next step is to read over your research. You should cluster similar information together, either by using a visual web cluster like we discussed in last week's video, or by color coding similar information with highlighters. You can also simply arrange the information in your notes on the computer if that's easier, or circle things and connect them with lines. Whatever method you choose, you want to start looking for patterns to reveal themselves to you, keeping in mind the common expectations that you've established for your review and for which you're looking for strong evidence to support. So for example, maybe your common expectations for a good student resource include welcoming environment and academic support. You would want to look through your research and group together any field notes, observations, interview responses, or information from the resource's website that deals with these things. These patterns that emerge can help you determine what your overall evaluation of the resource is going to be. This overall evaluation should be the one for which you have the most supporting evidence. You may find that you don't agree with the evaluation for which you have the most evidence, and this could offer you an interesting thesis, so don't worry if this is the case. For example, despite my own positive experience with this student resource, I found that, by and large, other students feel that this resource does not help alleviate their stress in any way. So even if you disagree with your research, you still have more research to support that other perspective. So you can still address your own perspective in there, but you're ultimately going to have to present the perspective for which you have the most convincing evidence. The clusters of information that you made will become the various points of evidence for your evaluation, which ultimately stems from determining whether or not your resource lives up to the common expectations that you've established. Finally, I'm going to offer a few notes on thesis statements, and we'll talk about this more next week. So thesis statements should address the genre and rhetorical situation. So what do I mean by address the genre? I mean that if the purpose of your genre, which is the review in this case, is to evaluate something, then your thesis should be making an evaluation. Should be saying whether something is good or whether something is bad, whether it's valuable or not valuable, whether it does or does not help students, alleviate student stress. And it should also address the rhetorical situation. So student stress being the sort of aspect or the angle that we're taking in this particular evaluation. So you need to make sure that you address that in your thesis. Your thesis should be specific. Don't make it too vague. This is a good resource is not a strong thesis. A thesis statement should appear in the introductory paragraph. It's usually the last sentence. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. And it should contain both an observation and an analysis. So an observation is more of your objective kind of information that you have, something that you've observed. And then the analysis is basically like the value judgment you're placing on that observation. So in this case, it's the evaluation that you're making of the resource based on the observation that you've made. So I wrote an example here. The Graduate Student Resource Center offers graduate students informative workshops to help them find jobs after getting their degrees. That is an observation because it is indisputable. That's a fact. But then the analysis I make from that is these offerings greatly reduce graduate student stress by helping graduate students focus on their studies rather than worrying about getting jobs. So if this were my thesis for my review of the Graduate Student Resource Center, then I would hopefully have interviews where I had graduate students saying exactly this, that I got to focus on my studies more because I had this workshop where people helped me, develop resumes and do job searches and, practice interviews and all of those sorts of things. So that's an example of a thesis that moves from observation to analysis. You'll notice that this thesis is 2 sentences long. Your thesis can be just 1 sentence, can be multiple sentences. I would try to keep it to 2, especially if you're going to go for the observation analysis pattern. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I hope that you'll email me over the weekend. You have a rough draft of this assignment due on Monday for peer review. It needs to be at least 3 pages long, and that needs to be 1-inch margins, Times New Roman, 12-point font, double spaced. So, because that's the requirements for the assignment as well. So let me know if anything comes up over the weekend. Otherwise, I'll see you on Monday.